Hello, this is David Rovix with another episode of Discussions with David, which is live streamed most weekdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. We're broadcasting at davidrovix.com/quarantine on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Cebu Community Radio, as well as via my channels on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, VK, and LinkedIn. You can find all these discussions archived on my YouTube channel in the Discussions with David playlist and in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform or go to davidrovix.com. If you have any suggestions for future guests on my show, or if you're involved in some way with a social media account, that might be a good place from which to live stream my discussions. I'm very interested in guest suggestions, and I have the capacity to add additional platforms to the broadcast. Today's guest grew up in Nigeria, moved to England, became a successful architect, and then threw all his sensible life plans to the wind to start writing and performing plays. His play, Call Mr. Robeson, about the life and times of radical musician, athlete, and linguist Paul Robeson, has won awards and inspired standing ovations from New Zealand to Nunavut. His most recent play, Just an Ordinary Lawyer, tells the story of Nigerian Tunji Sowande, who immigrated to England in 1945 and eventually became the first black judge to work in the UK, albeit part-time. Tayo Aluko, welcome to my little live stream show. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you, David.
One of the things that can be found on YouTube is part of a tribute to the poet Langston Hughes, and I wonder if you have the poem Harlem handy, which seems especially relevant given the fire rising from Minneapolis at the moment.
That's right. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
It's always that poem. It's so short and so powerful, huh? It's just
it's wonderful. Yeah.
You know, I mean, I wasn't necessarily planning on just getting all heavy right away, but I mean, it's it's kind of impossible in light of recent events in Minneapolis and Georgia and elsewhere. It just seems like the more things change, the more things stay the same. And it occurs to me that that may have been one of your main inspirations in telling the stories that you tell, which are so often, well, actually always about people whose lives are so relevant in light of these ongoing events. And I don't know. That's not really much of a question, and so much as just a
it's a statement of the well, it's not necessarily obvious, but it is what I do, and it is what I was inspired to do just by coming across the story of Paul Robeson.
When did you first come across that story? Were you still in Africa, or is that after you?
No, it was here in Liverpool, where I live, and this I remember it to the day and almost to the minute, because it was June 23rd, 1995, which was the summer solstice, and there's a park not far from where I live called Sefton Park, and there was a magnificent palm house, a Victorian palm house, which by at that time in 1995 had long been very derelict. And the Friends of Sefton Park Palm House had annual fundraisers, and on this day they invited me to be part of this event. They called it the Dawn Chorus. So at 5:36 a.m. I was in Sefton Park along with, I don't know, 100 other people in this Palm House, I remember somebody saying, can somebody close the windows, because all the windows were shattered. And I was asked to sing, and I chose to sing a particular song that I thought was appropriate, My Lord What a Morning, the spiritual. And after I had sung, a lady came up to me and said, you remind me of Paul Robeson. Do you sing many of his songs? And I thought, Paul Robeson. I may have heard that name, but I'm not sure of his music. And that was it. And then 2 months later, I was in the library in Liverpool. It must have been the American section. I don't know what it was I was looking for, something to do with civil rights, I don't know. But up on the shelf was this book, Paul Robeson. I recognized the name, I borrowed it, and that was it. It changed my life. And as you say, I used to be an architect. I was working as an architect then. And in 2008, 13 years later, I ended up giving up architecture to start touring the play full-time. Full-time is not exactly the right description, because I just had a few performances, certainly in that first year, but it slowly built up, and I have since taken it literally around the world, and I'm still performing it. I've done hundreds of performances, and like you, who's been performing for years, in my case at least, I just find every single performance an absolute joy.
Yeah, absolutely. And but it's, well, there's so many places I want to go here, but it's always the problem I have with these interviews. It's like an hour, and I'm always feeling like there's just not going to be enough time. But it's anyway. The one thing I wanted to ask about was just like in terms of those that touring and performing, how has the recent events affected your plans for touring? I think you had all kinds of tour plans, including coming to the United States.
That's right. I wasn't due in the United States until November. One of those has already been cancelled. The one after that is very likely to be cancelled. I had several performances in the UK. In fact, I had one cancelled the day before. That was the first one in March. But yes, it's the same with all of us. But it's happened to coincide with the time when I wanted to start writing a new play, a third play. And so I have actually just finished the first sketch draft of it. And it seems to be something that if it goes as well as the other two have gone, then it will be a play that I think would be worth performing and worth touring with, and hopefully will be enjoyed and would do what I set out to do, which is try to share the kind of history of the world as it relates to African history. I mean, the world economic and political system wouldn't be the way it was now without the involvement and the exploitation of Africa. And new one is.
Oh, we're having connection issues here. Okay. Sorry, Tayo, I lost you for a couple minutes, for a couple seconds. You're nearest the router that you can be wherever your router is. Yeah. Okay. Nothing to be done then. That's fine. Tayo, who was Coleridge Taylor? This Coleridge Taylor is the subject of the play that you've just finished, and it seems like I was thinking also that it's kind of for all the people. I mean, of course, everybody in the world is experiencing this pandemic in such radically different ways that it's you can't make generalizations, but it's true that in so many places people are experiencing a lot of difficulty with isolation, even if they have the means to feed themselves and pay the rent while they're isolating themselves. And it seems like in a sense, like artists maybe have a certain advantage in that situation, because you may have been planning on touring and performing, but you can kind of switch gears and write a play with that time. I mean, maybe not everybody can. I know some artists who are really just they have to be performing all the time, and if they're not performing, they get really depressed, and that's a problem for people. But other people can manage to shift gears and just go into solo mode and write a play, and you seem to have done pretty well with the isolation.
Yes, it's I'm fortunate in that way, and it has worked out. And it probably wouldn't have been so easy without the internet, if I didn't have the internet, because the playwriting involves a lot of historical research, and so being able to do that, from my laptop has been wonderful. So yes, it's worked out well. So your question about Samuel Coleridge Taylor was, he was a British composer who was born in 1875, and he died very young in 1912 at the age of 37. But by then he'd already become a world famous composer. Not to be confused with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was a poet from the 17th century, I think.
Excellent.
But Samuel Coleridge Taylor's father was from Sierra Leone, and he'd studied medicine in England, and had what seems to have been a brief affair with a woman in London, an English woman in London, and then gone back to Freetown without even realizing that his girlfriend was pregnant. So Samuel and his father, Daniel Taylor, never met. So Samuel Coleridge Taylor's most famous work is Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, a big choral cantata. And Daniel Taylor had another son in Freetown called George Taylor. And George found out sometime in his adulthood that Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Coleridge was initially his middle name, but it became Coleridge Taylor as a surname. And George found out that Samuel Coleridge Taylor was his brother, half-brother, so he changed his name to George Coleridge Taylor. And one of his first son was also called George Coleridge Taylor, and it is he through whom I tell the story of Samuel Coleridge Taylor. So I'm inventing the fact that George Coleridge Taylor, my character, after retirement as a diplomat for the Sierra Leonean government, decides that he wants to sing. He wants to compile a concert of his uncle Samuel's songs. But he's doing this
vehicle.
Yeah. And he's doing this in the context, based in Freetown, of a country that is emerging from a terrible civil war. And then the causes of the war, which you can go back through the various governments that Sierra Leone has had, to the colonial era, to the transatlantic slave trade and before. So it's that whole package that I'm trying to tell through with the songs of Samuel and his daughter, who was also a composer, that I'm trying to package into a play with songs.
I can't wait to see it.
Coleridge Taylor of Freetown.
It just sounds like, I mean, having only just heard the synopsis, it just sounds like such a powerful vehicle for telling this whole massive story in a way that could be so easily overwhelming if you're just trying to give people facts and information, which is just you could just shut down as soon as you hear it, because it's just too terrible to even try to take in the scope of the horrors that have gone on. And even it's even very difficult to take in when you're just telling the story of one individual, but it seems to me it's somehow then possible for anybody to identify with it. Is that what I mean, what was it that made you think that this was how you wanted to try to tell stories, like to tell the stories through one-man plays like you do, like so powerfully? There's so
Well,
many other ways to tell stories, you
that
know.
is true. That is true. Well, when I finished reading Paul Robeson's biography, and I remember it very clearly too, I finished it in my bedroom at 1 p.m. on Christmas morning. Uh, I live on my own, so there was nothing to get up for on Christmas morning in 1995. And I remember it's one of the last times that there was a lot of snow outside. I just had to stay in bed to finish this story. And I said there and then, somebody has to tell this story. And I had never written a play then. I had acted, as an amateur in plays and musicals. But it started off with 10 years later, I started writing it myself, having tried other playwrights. And then I wrote several drafts, which started with a six characters, went up to 14 characters. And then I was invited to the US in California for a conference on art songs by African American composers. And the guy who organized it had heard me sing Coleridge Taylor. And that's why he invited me, because Coleridge Taylor had been regarded as an honorary African American because he really inspired African Americans. And I decided to present my 14 character play read by me to this conference. And that's when it began to feel that it could be a solo play. And then, when I came back, I was advised strongly to rewrite it. And that's how it has come about. But as artists, we are blessed. We are blessed by our gifts. I mean, I've heard you live really teach me histories in a song that lasts 2.5 minutes that I wouldn't have known. And and I think that those of us who have these gifts, we feel that we just have to share them. If we feel that we can do something to help make the world a better place.
When I when I heard you do the one-man play called Mr. Robeson, it was an amazing experience for me. It was a fantastic performance, a fantastic piece of writing, everything about it. But it also made me want to do the same kind of thing. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But suddenly I wanted to also write a one-man musical play and do it. But I haven't gotten into that actually yet. I think I will eventually.
Maybe we'll collaborate one day.
Oh, hey, then it'll have to be more than a one man, or we can just collaborate in other ways too. Yeah, absolutely.
You do it one day, I'll do it the next.
I'll definitely need help. But and speaking of collaboration, though, you've gotten a lot of feedback from other people along the way that has actually, you've done a lot of rewriting of things because of feedback, which is like interesting to hear you talk about that, because it's something that happens with lots of us. But I think there's also so many people who are just totally allergic to feedback, and they just, they're usually not the greatest artists. Though I don't know what do you have to say about that development as an artist for other people and the importance of feedback?
Oh, it's crucial. I mean, you get a lot of feedback a lot of the time, and people say, with Robeson, for instance, some people will say, "Oh, that was great. I didn't know that he was so political. We just know him as a singer." Other people say, "Oh, we wish there was more singing in the play." And then somebody else will say, "Oh, why didn't you put this incident in?" Well, one example of some excellent feedback that I got was in my second play, Just an Ordinary Lawyer. When I have, I wanted to try to tell the story of what everybody knows as the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. Mm. So I told, my character meets somebody who talks about the Mau Mau, and I think I sort of sent a section of that play, that text, to a forum that I belong to, British and Asian Studies Association. And somebody came back to me and said, I hope you will consider calling it by its rightful name,
Mm.
the Land and Freedom Army,
Ah,
which is what it is.
wow.
And, the play had been performed several times by then. It had been published. But I said, thank you very much for that information. And I changed it. And the next edition of the script has that correction. So feedback is good, not always good, but when
Not
it is,
always, but sometimes. The
yeah,
Mau Mau Rebellion was so how did it became known as the Mau Mau Rebellion? I always assumed that was because of something, some kind of geographical or tribal reference, but the group was actually called the Land and Freedom Army.
correct.
I'd never knew that. That's amazing. And
Really
it's like, it's also like, I mean, with so many of these stories, I struggle with this myself, but I think that with some of the stories you tell, it's more of a struggle actually, because like even just telling the story of that rebellion, I mean, even just sharing minor details, they are so horrific. It is so, I mean, it is so mentally scarring, even to know the very minor details about how the British treated the soldiers that they captured, which
exactly.
you must have to talk about that. And I mean, how do you deal with and also in the International Museum of Slavery in Liverpool, you are a featured actor talking about the history of slavery, which is a powerful presentation in there, which I don't think I even realized that you were going to be in there when I went to that museum. But I mean, your visage on the screen. But how like, yeah, how do you deal with that? Trying to tell a story and not completely overwhelm people with the horror of the story, or maybe, I mean, where do you?
Okay, let me give you one example. There's a lot of history in Just an Ordinary Lawyer. I created a character who was like a foil to Tunji Shawande, who was a rather conservative lawyer. But I created a character called Laddie Williams, who was much more radical and fiery. And, Tunji Shawande meets Laddie Williams, and Laddie says, "You must read my article in this paper." And then, Laddie, Tunji at one point picks up the letter in the play. Sir, the trend of events in Kenya serve as a stark reminder, if any were needed, that oh gosh, it's going to be difficult to do this.
From memory, yeah.
British colonialist, oh boy. Was it not the British who caused the deaths of 28 brave servicemen in Accra for protesting in demand of pensions at the promised levels? No, it is not necessary. Oh, I'm sorry, but basically, in the form of a letter, you can portray a lot of information which would otherwise be very dry, as long as the letter is not too long. But in that little passage, I had examples of British brutality, basically, and the way that the narrative can be twisted to make the people who are brutal seem to be the victims.
Which in a way can, yeah. So then you can see how twisted that is to make the perpetrators into victims, but at the same time you can talk about the brutality in a way that is sort of possible to hear without being completely debilitated.
In a few weeks, months, or years, there will be a piece of very powerful drama which talks about what happened today in your country, whereby a black man is murdered on the streets in view of full cameras, and within a few hours, the President of the United States is encouraging militias to take their arms to go and shoot people who are demonstrating.
And 7 shots were fired at demonstrators in Louisville, Kentucky last night.
I heard one person died, as you know. I don't know
That
whether-
was also, that was in Minneapolis, that apparently somebody shot one of the demonstrators and killed someone. And in St. Louis, there were 7 shots fired. 2 people are undergoing surgery right now in hospital.
But already people are being called looters to be killed because of brutality of one innocent black man. And the thing is that artists can do really powerful things with a few words, with a few songs, and a poem, and so on. And that's why I think that we should be, but are recognized as essential workers, because we have the ability to convey a lot of thought and action, inspire action, quite simply through art.
Absolutely. And on that note, do you have greatness in the time of COVID handy?
Yes.
I haven't normally gotten my guests to actually, perform, but because you do poetry, it seems like we can, it's easier with the microphones at hand, because if you're playing an instrument, it's gonna, it's harder. Might as well just refer people to the web, like find somewhere where you can actually hear the piano, but
this is an interesting one because the COVID situation. A line came to me, and it ended up being the very, very last line. I'll just read it. We made our homes in the belly of the beast that devoured our ancestors and spat them out on the other side of the globe, that stole our gold and rubber, our skills and knowledge, our art and music, our history. It gorged and fattened itself, dressed in unmissable finery, and declared itself proudly the empire. It saw its greatness in our puzzled eyes as we stared up the barrel of a gun from all corners of the earth. Its guns were needed still, we were told, to protect us from the socialists and communists. Capitalism, our enslaver for centuries, will liberate us one day. It bought our rulers and continued the quiet theft of our humanity and our dignity as it planted poison and bombs where once there was rice and diamonds. And then the virus came, silent, swift, and deadly. We answered the call to the front line to confront this invisible enemy. We asked simply for gloves, masks, visors, and gowns. As we fell one by one, we finally began to see that what the gentle ones had been whispering loudly had been true all along. We'd been feeding on the beast's excrement, unmindful of the fact that the empire has no clothes.
Yes. Yes, and it's just the most, it is the perfect line to end with, and it is just so very true. And I mean, it's so reminiscent of that whole story of what is it, Hans Christian Andersen, of the emperor with no clothes.
Exactly.
It's this whole sort of rule by a rule of fantasy. These people saying everything is the economy is booming and all this, and there's only so many times you can say the economy is booming while the number of millions of people homeless continue to grow. But then at the point where you have so many people dying of disease, and so disproportionately depending on their race, their profession, their class. It's just then it's all laid bare. And what I mean, you've traveled extensively around many countries, including the United States. You live in England. What is your thoughts on the fact that the U.S. and the U.K. are two of the most devastated countries currently in the pandemic?
Well, actually, considering it's not a surprise, considering who is in charge of the countries at present. And it's such a tragedy that because of various manipulations, cheating, it could be so very, very, very different. The virus would have come whatever, but if in your country in 2016, the Democratic Party hadn't manipulated the primaries, and Bernie Sanders was the candidate, and I'm pretty sure he would have won and been president right now, things would have been very, very different. To a lot of socialists, maybe not enough, but the fact is that there wouldn't be the issue of most people not having access to healthcare without being able to pay for it. Here in the UK, a guy called Jeremy Corbyn was deprived of winning the election, again by some cheating within the Labour Party and outside, and a horrendous 4 or 5 year long media attack on this man who, and in fact, that his story, in fact, inspired part of that poem. We came to realize that what the gentle ones had been whispering loudly had been true all along. This guy is a man who is there for peace, and the media just attacked him. And anyway, he lost election. But if he'd be there now, the National Health Service, of which Britain is rightly proud, would have, the issue of private, PPE would not have caused so many deaths. So it could be so different now. But the way the media is, the way a lot of ordinary people are who believe that Britain was a great empire, we need to bring it back, which is why a lot of people voted for Brexit. Other people voted for different reasons, but there is, so it's no surprise that, England, the UK and the United States are in such terrible situations now, and Brazil, it's really shocking. But, the fight continues.
Yeah. And then as we talk about how bad things are in the US and the UK with the virus, it's in all likelihood in a few months, the whole situation will be different. And I mean, hopefully that's not the case, and hopefully all these Cuban doctors will be able to contain the pandemic in many of the countries where they're very actively and effectively working. But if things play out in any way like they did in 1918, then and of course, like in 1918, the world is full of extreme poverty, extremely densely populated areas with extreme poverty, with lots of people who lack electricity and running water and live in refugee camps all over the place. So we can be fairly certain that the majority of those dying will ultimately be in those kinds of places, although it has to trickle down because it starts out with people who are traveling by air and going to capital cities, and it seems to be sort of filtering outwards in a different sort of method of filtering than in 1918, when it was being spread by soldiers returning home from World War I to their home countries.
But I mean, the research I've been doing for this current play,
Have you come
remind
across 1918 much?
not that, but it's just that I'm concentrating on in this play on the activism and the power of women. So I am, when you're talking about poverty and so on, I'm reminded of the fact that in many cases in Africa, in the anti-colonialist struggle, huge gains were made by market women. One example was in 1949 in Nigeria, in Abeokuta, a woman called Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, who happened to be the mother of Fela Kuti.
Ah, wow.
Right. She led the market women to protest taxes that the the colonial government was imposing on them through the local king, the Ake. So he was a stooge, and she led a massive protest, which eventually led to the Ake having to abdicate. He had to step down, and the taxes were removed. In Sierra Leone, in 1951, I think it was, there was a similar demonstration by the market women there because the rice prices were being manipulated by Lebanese traders. And again, that led to them taking over the wholesale of the market. Now, that's a very good example, the powerful activism and great results coming from market women in Sierra Leone.
Mm-hmm.
But soon after that, on independence, they got, various male presidents, and women have always been largely sidelined in Sierra Leonean politics. It is no coincidence that the place deteriorated to such an extent that they had a civil war and remain one of the poorest countries in the world today, not forgetting what happened before independence and how the British manipulated who became in charge of the countries and so on. So I'm just saying all that to say that scary as it is, and we are, it's lucky that, the COVID hasn't sort of blown up in Africa to the extent that one expected. It may do, but it's going to be the regular people, especially the women, who are going to help us through this if we give them the respect and the resources and the space to take charge.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Mm. There was something I haven't, I don't know if it's how much of it is coincidence or not, but there was a story, I believe, on BBC actually about how only 7% of the world's nations are headed by female heads of state, but most of the ones that are headed by women have in common the fact that they've dealt really effectively with the pandemic.
That's right. That's right. So, I did a newsletter only yesterday, and I said I'm trying to write a feminist play, and that and then I'm going to be asking for feedback, because I want people to be my judge and my guide as I write the play. To a man, and I'm going to have at least one female character that I'm going to sort of morph into at some point. But it's becoming clearer to me, actually, just by doing this play about this British musician, male, and the fact that his nephew, who's my protagonist, had 9 daughters. So that's where it all started.
Mm.
This should be a play about women, and therefore, it became about women's power. So it's interesting how sort of the mind works, and it ends up on paper. Yeah.
It sounds like the process that you hear a lot of people who are writing a novel, they don't necessarily know how it's going to go or how it's going to end, because as the characters develop, the plot changes.
That's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Before we started, there's another. This all started with me stumbling on the story of Paul Robeson in 1995, and there is one thing that he wrote in 1946 that keeps coming up again and again, which I'd like to share with you, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. It's July 29th, 1946. He sent a telegram to President Truman, and he says he was chairman of the Council on African Affairs, and he says the Council on African Affairs demand that the federal government take immediate effective steps to apprehend and punish the perpetrators of this shocking crime, and to halt the rising tide of lynch law. This was after 4 men had been lynched in Georgia. Only when our government has taken such action, he says, toward protecting its own citizens, can its role in aiding the progress of peoples of other countries be viewed with trust and hope.
Yeah.
1946, that's 74 years ago.
Yeah.
And here we are again. So that man was a prophet.
And of course, he was talking about, I mean, you could call him a prophet for lots of good reason, but at the same time, he's talking about the current reality at the time, which is still the current reality, which was the current reality in 1918 and 1926 and 1869 and whatever, as soon as the Union Army pulled out of the South. I mean, there's just,
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that, he traced his ancestry to the Igbo people of Nigeria. Some of his ancestors would probably have made it to Canada, having fought for the British and ended up in Nova Scotia. And when they got there, that was their reward for fighting for the Union side. When they
have a place to live in Canada or no?
Yes, they were promised land and so on.
Did they get it?
They got it, but it was very cold, and it wasn't very fertile. So
like a 2-week growing season. But if you're into fishing, there's a lot of fish. Not a very good place to be a farmer. Neither is Norway, but there's really good fishing.
Right. But then they also, encountered racism. And so some of them decided to take up the offer to go to Africa and ended up in Freetown, Sierra Leone. So these links, the history is shared, and it's that kind of history that not everybody knows that. And this kind of thing that I try to sort of mesh into a narrative which hopefully will be entertaining as well as educational.
Yeah, and I think on that note, in terms of these connections with the history, with the geography, with the whole African diaspora, the whole exploitation of Africa. I mean, it's all so sort of neatly connected in you as a person. I mean, traveling around the United States as someone from Nigeria and performing this play about Paul Robeson, all of that together, to say nothing of the quality of the performance in the play, but just who you are doing that work seems to have a particular impact on people in terms of understanding the connections here that you're also making in so many ways in the play, but also in terms of what Paul Robeson himself talked about, but also who you are as a performer doing this work. I wonder also just writing songs that as I do about historical events, I often kind of get lost in it. And when I wrote a novel once, and I think about the characters in the novel, even though they're all fictional, like they're friends of mine, and like, and one of them I think of as I am that person because it was written from this person's perspective, although I am not this person, but it gets confusing and a bit weird. And I wonder how much you might have that experience with going around so much performing a play about Paul Robeson. Like, I mean, it feels like you're channeling Paul Robeson. And I know from experience that some of these 90-year-olds who are in the audience, and you attract more 90-year-olds to your performances than anybody outside of an elder care facility, and that's very interesting too. Like these people who were young adults or teenagers in the 1930s, some of whom are still alive and coming to your gigs. And like when they were in their 70s and I was younger and performing, that generation frequently came to my shows. But now that they're in their 90s, they don't come to my shows anymore when I used to do them, but they're coming to your shows and with assistants walking and whatever. But it's really quite something. And they have it really feels like you're feeding something that they really need, this connection. And they went to hear Paul Robeson back in the 60s and they miss him.
Yeah, that's right. And it's really, that's one of the most pleasant parts of performing. I always do a question and answer session afterwards, and the older people, from their 60s to their 90s would tell the stories of having heard, met, listened to whatever Paul Robeson. And but as you know, having seen the play, I channel Paul Robeson from the moment I walk on stage, but I stop being Paul Robeson when I walk off stage, and I come back as myself. I have heard of people who live as the characters that they have written about, which I would say I'm fortunate not to do that. I mean, nobody can be Paul Robeson, but I am me, and I think it's rather unhealthy to allow such a character to sort of take over your life completely. And then the characters that I write, it's not always the case. I mean, Paul Robeson, you can person. But having written a play about Paul Robeson, anybody else that you write about that I portray will not come close. So it's a good thing that I'm not investing myself so in the character so much. And there are always things that you discover about a person that are not necessarily things that everybody would like to hear about. Nobody's perfect, and so I don't necessarily. There's nobody that I cannot imagine writing and portraying anybody else that I would love as much as Paul Robeson. Put it that way.
He was. I mean, he actually. He had such a wide variety of skills that it's kind of hard to imagine that one person actually had all those skills. I mean, not just minor level skills, but like really high level. I mean, athlete, musician, linguist, also in the sciences. I mean, just astounding character.
Sportsman, lawyer, orator. And the tragedy that somebody like that should have been so suppressed for speaking the truth. And I very often equate him to somebody who's suffering similarly today, who's Mumia Abu-Jamal. An incredibly brilliant mind who was framed for, and I'm pretty sure I know that's a case, that he was framed for a murder that he did not commit.
And if he had committed it, it wouldn't have been murder, because whoever committed that so-called murder was defending Mumia's brother from a savage beating by the police. So it was self-defense. Whoever did that was standing their ground under current American law, and even if he had done it, he never should have gone to prison for it.
There you go. But Mumia was on death row until 5, 6 years ago, and is now still in life. But even from within prison, this man is speaking and writing as much wisdom as practically every pundits that you have on the media in the United States, spouts in a whole year. He would give a 5-minute broadcast that has more wisdom and truth than all of them put together. But he is so dangerous just by the clarity of his vision and what he says and writes that they'd rather keep him back there. That's what happened to Paul Robeson, and hopefully Mumia will, and so many others who deserve to be out and sort of being these are our heroes, our leaders. Hopefully they would remain there for too much longer.
It seems that regardless of all the propaganda of these countries like the United States and the United Kingdom that are always, whose leaders are always espousing free speech and freedom of the press and all this kind of stuff, it's just it's fantasy, and words are so powerful, and people who have too many powerful words, they get rid of them in one way or another. And I'm also reminded of the situation with Jeremy Corbyn and the British media, and how, like, you were mentioning that earlier, but it's just astounding. Words apparently are much too powerful for the British media to be able to handle, because they just completely ignored him. I mean, and like the way they would ignore all the leaders of Sinn Féin and the IRA, like, never have them speak. Are their words so powerful you can't even let Jerry Adams say something?
Yeah. And in Nigeria, another good example was Wole Soyinka, who ended up winning a Nobel Prize for Literature. Was it Nobel Prize? Yes, Nobel Prize for Literature. He was in prison for several years for writing the truth. Thankfully, he's still alive and well in his 80s. Kenya had Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So we, and it's like that all over the world. So, for those of us who are out and able to roam freely, I just consider it our duty to honor all these brave people, and honor our ancestors by doing what we do, because they suffered a lot more for it than we do right now. However hard it is, even in normal times, to barely earn a living doing what we do. I
mean, for artists, most artists, I guess, in the UK or the US, like, you're the worst thing that's going to happen to you probably is you'll just be poor and you'll be ignored. By that's and if you're lucky, you'll make a living and you'll have an audience, right? But maybe a big audience. But the worst thing is likely to happen is you'll be just ignored by the media. And but in a sense, I wonder, what is that in terms of the scheme of things? I mean, obviously, it's much better to be poor and ignored than it is to be assassinated. Okay, obviously, we'd rather be alive than dead. Okay, but but at the same time, when you're assassinated, you might become a martyr if you've lived long enough to have produced a whole lot of good art, and they're not assassinating you at the age of 17. You might have actually produced a lot of good work, and then you're going to be remembered. Everybody knows who Victor Jara is. Or at least not everybody, but a lot of people know who he is, who wouldn't have known who he was, even though he was a brilliant musician. They wouldn't have known who he was unless he was killed, Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, I guess it's worse to be assassinated than to be ignored. But I think, sometimes I think that the fate of a lot of artists in the West, and particularly in the US, where there's no government support for the art, and where basically, you're either going to be a star or you're going to be nobody. I mean, I wonder, what do you think about that conundrum?
I am always inspired by the story of a guy called Solomon Northup. who wrote a book. Probably was barely, I don't know how much it was read in his time. He died. He wrote his life experience. He died, and the book was discovered again in the 1960s. Somebody wrote about it, and then it, and then several years later, somebody else picked it up, gave it to her husband, and the husband decided to make a movie out of this man's story. And that movie was 12 Years a Slave. Mm. So even if as artists we are ignored and we are poor and we die, as long as what we have produced is good, it is a seed planted which will wait for the right circumstances, the right amount of light and water to sprout into something beautiful. So that's
wonderful. I think Joe Hill said something like that.
Did he? Right?
Wasn't that or Joe Hill's last will? Actually, was the last thing he wrote. Was yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I think about these interviews. Like, even if only 7 people might watch them live, when the person I'm interviewing might die in a few decades, they're going to find that, and it'll be up on YouTube. if the planet isn't a total smoldering ruins, and we still have YouTube server farms in Iceland, yeah.
And then they'll make the links. Who was this David Rovics guy? Yeah.
Tayo, thank you so much for joining me for this little discussion. It's been a great pleasure. And I don't know where the hour went, as usual, but it somehow is gone. But
yeah, well, there we go. It's great. Yeah, it's an honor. Thank you very much for asking me.
Great pleasure. Thank you. See you again, I hope. Can I get you back to there's I suspect over the next few weeks there might be a lot happening in the world for us to talk about. So
that's true.
Yeah. Take care, Tayo.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion with Liverpool-based playwright Tayo Aluko. On Monday, I'll be hosting the 6th Pandemic Open Mic Monday. Everyone with a song, poem, or a rant is very welcome to sign up, which you can do at davidrovics.com/POMM. For Pandemic Open Mic Mondays. The open mic and my other live stream broadcasts happen every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. On Tuesdays, the show is Fifth Estate Live, produced by longtime Detroit area talk show host and founder of the Fifth Estate magazine, Peter Werby. Wednesday through Friday, I'm both the host and the producer for Discussions with David. Regardless, it's every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, broadcast on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, the Song News Network, and my own channels on Facebook, Periscope, YouTube, Twitch, VK, and LinkedIn. And once again, all of these episodes are archived on the Discussions with David playlist on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovics, as well as in the video section on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, among other places. Each episode is put up in audio podcast form soon after it's been broadcast live, which you can find if you look for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform. We are very much interested in broadcasting on additional platforms, so if you're involved with an organization, a network, or any other group that has a presence on social media that maybe completely lacks any kind of live streaming content, perhaps you want to consider having some of that, which I can potentially provide for you for free. It's a pretty good arrangement, I'd say. Producing and broadcasting this programming every day is not free, however, either in terms of money or in terms of my time. And if you want to support my live streaming, podcasting, songwriting, and recording efforts, whether there's a global pandemic on or not, but particularly at the moment when we touring performers are not able to tour, please feel free to send a one-off donation to me at paypal.me/DavidRovics or become an ongoing patron at davidrovics.com/subscribe or at patreon.com/DavidRovics, where all of these episodes can be found in both video and audio form, along with various exclusive content that's only available for my patrons, such as my 16-part audio memoir. Whether you're in Portland, Oregon or not, if you want to be involved in any way with the rent strike activities here or anywhere else, please check out artistsforrentcontrol.org for some of the popular education resources currently up, and then come back there in a week or so, by which time we should have some more concrete ways for folks to connect in mutual aid efforts to stop the evictions before they start. Hope to see you again soon in cyberspace, and who knows where else. Mutual aid and solidarity will get us through. Don't pay the rent. Bye-bye for now.